When I walked into my sister's wedding wearing judicial robes instead of a guest dress, the entire room went silent. But the real shock came when I announced that the $580,000 she'd stolen from me while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed was about to be returned with interest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Zoe Harper, and 3 months ago I was supposed to die. Instead, I lived to become the one thing my sister Chloe never saw coming, the judge presiding over her financial ruin. The cardiac monitor's steady beeping was the soundtrack to the worst 6 weeks of my life. Pacific Northwest Medical Center's intensive care unit became my world after a massive heart attack at 28. Something the doctors said was a genetic time bomb that finally exploded. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while machines kept my body functioning. And during those endless hours staring at the ceiling tiles, I had no idea my sister was systematically destroying my future. Chloe visited exactly twice during my entire stay. The first time was on day 3, when she breezed through the door wearing designer sunglasses and a flowing maxi dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She perched on the edge of the visitor's chair like she was afraid the hospital might contaminate her perfectly manicured appearance. "God, Zoe, you look terrible," she said, not bothering to lower her voice despite the other patients separated only by thin curtains. "The doctors are saying it's going to be months before you're back on your feet. Months." She emphasized the word like it was personally inconvenient to her. I could barely speak above a whisper then, my throat raw from the breathing tube they'd finally removed the day before. "The cabin," I managed to croak out. "Did you check on Grandma Rose's place?" Chloe's expression flickered for just a moment, so brief I almost missed it. "Oh, that old thing. Don't worry about property, right? Now focus on getting better." She stood up abruptly, checking her phone. "I have to run. Real estate showing in an hour." That was lie number 1, though I wouldn't discover it for weeks. Her second visit came on day 38, right before my discharge. This time she arrived with a thick manila envelope and a smile that looked like it had been painted on with expensive lipstick. "I brought some paperwork for you to sign," she announced, settling into the chair with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this moment. "Legal stuff about Grandma Rose's estate. You know how complicated these things get when someone's been, well, incapacitated." My hands shook as I tried to focus on the documents. The medication made everything blurry, and the words seemed to swim across the pages. Trust modification, property transfer, beneficiary adjustment, legal terminology that felt like a foreign language in my compromised state. "What exactly am I signing?" I asked, squinting at the fine print. "Just updating some outdated language," Chloe said smoothly, already holding out a pen. "The lawyers said we needed to modernize Grandma's will to avoid tax complications. It's all standard procedure." I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded to speak with the attorney myself. I should have trusted the uneasy feeling that twisted in my stomach every time Chloe smiled that particular smile. But I was exhausted, medicated, and desperate to trust that my only sister wouldn't take advantage of me when I was at my most vulnerable. So I signed. The ink was barely dry when Chloe folded the papers back into the envelope, with the efficiency of someone completing a business transaction. "There," she said, standing up. "All settled. Now you can focus on recovery without worrying about legal complications." She kissed my forehead, the kind of gesture that looked affectionate to anyone watching but felt hollow against my skin. "I'll check on you once you're home," she promised, already walking toward the door. That was lie number 2. Coming home to my small apartment in Portland's Pearl District felt like emerging from an alternate universe. The familiar sounds of traffic and city life seemed amplified after weeks of hospital quiet, and everything in my space looked exactly the same while I felt fundamentally changed. The stack of medical bills on my kitchen counter had grown into a small mountain, and my savings account showed a balance that made my chest tighten with anxiety that had nothing to do with my heart condition. For the first month of recovery, I focused on the basics: physical therapy 3 times a week, cardiac rehabilitation, learning to climb stairs without feeling like I was drowning in my own chest. My world had shrunk to doctor appointments and slow walks around the neighborhood, measuring progress in city blocks rather than miles. Chloe kept her distance, communicating only through brief text messages that felt more like status updates than genuine concern. "Hope you're feeling better. Thinking of you. Let me know if you need anything." The kind of messages you send to maintain plausible deniability while avoiding actual involvement. It wasn't until I tried to access my online banking to pay the growing pile of medical bills that the first crack appeared in what I thought was my reality. I needed to transfer money from my savings to cover the expenses, but when I logged into the account that should have contained the settlement, from Grandma Rose's estate, the balance showed 0. Not low, 0. I stared at the screen for a full minute, certain there had to be some kind of error. Grandma Rose had left me her Lake Tahoe cabin in her will, and when the family decided to sell it rather than maintain the property, my share of the proceeds should have been $580,000, money I'd been counting on, to cover my medical expenses and provide some stability while I recovered. My hands trembled as I called the bank's customer service line, navigating through automated menus until I reached a human voice. "I need to check on a recent transfer," I told the representative, providing my account information. "There should have been a large deposit last month from an estate settlement." The sound of typing filled the silence. "I show a deposit of $580,000 on September 15th, the woman confirmed, and then a withdrawal of the same amount on September 22nd. My stomach dropped. A withdrawal? To where? The funds were transferred to another account at our institution. Would you like me to provide the reference number for that transaction? I wrote down the numbers with a shaking hand, already, knowing what I would find when I traced them. The withdrawal had been authorized by my signature, the same signature I'd provided on those documents Chloe brought to the hospital. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the reference number until the digits blurred together. Chloe hadn't brought me legal updates to sign. She'd brought me transfer authorizations, carefully crafted to look like routine estate paperwork, while actually moving my inheritance directly into her control. The betrayal hit harder than my heart attack had. At least the cardiac event was random, a cruel twist of genetics and bad timing. This was calculated, deliberate, planned during the weeks when she knew I was too sick to protect myself. I spent the rest of that day pulling every document I could find related to Grandma Rose's estate. The original will was clear. The Lake Tahoe property was to be divided equally between Chloe and me if we chose to sell. But somewhere between Grandma's death and my hospitalization, additional paperwork had been filed, modifications that essentially transferred my portion to Chloe in the event of medical incapacitation or extended care requirements. The language was specific enough that it had clearly been crafted by someone who knew exactly what was coming. That evening, I called our parents for the first time since leaving the hospital. Mom answered on the third ring, her voice immediately taking on the careful tone people use when they're not sure how sick you still are. "Zoe, honey, how are you feeling? We've been so worried." "I'm calling about the cabin money," I said, too drained for small talk. "Did you know Chloe transferred my inheritance into her account while I was in the hospital?" The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Mom finally spoke, her voice had shifted into what I recognized as her conflict avoidance mode. "Well, sweetie, we knew there were some legal adjustments that needed to be made. Chloe said the estate lawyers recommended consolidating everything to avoid complications while you were recovering. Mom, she took $580,000 that belonged to me. I'm sure it's just temporary, honey. You know how complex these estate things can be. Have you talked to Chloe directly about this?" I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of my family's tendency to smooth over problems rather than address them. She's not returning my calls. Well, she's been incredibly busy with the wedding planning. You know how stressful that can be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maybe wait until after the ceremony to bring up financial details. The wedding. In all the chaos of my medical crisis and financial discovery, I'd almost forgotten that Chloe was getting married in 6 weeks to Marcus, a successful attorney she'd been dating for 2 years. The same attorney who probably helped draft the paperwork that transferred my inheritance. When exactly did she get these estate modifications filed? I asked. Another pause. I'm not sure of the exact dates, sweetheart, but I know the lawyers said timing was important because of your medical situation. The pieces were clicking together with horrible clarity. Chloe hadn't waited for a convenient opportunity to steal from me. She'd created the opportunity, using my heart attack as the perfect cover for financial manipulation she'd probably been planning for months. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment as darkness fell over the city, feeling more alone than I had even during the loneliest nights in the hospital. At least then I'd had the excuse of being genuinely helpless. Now I was discovering that the people I'd trusted most had been systematically taking advantage of that helplessness. But as I stared out my window at the lights of downtown Portland, something shifted inside me. The same determination that had gotten me through cardiac rehabilitation, that had pushed me to relearn basic activities my damaged heart could handle, began focusing on a new goal. Chloe had made a crucial mistake. She'd assumed that nearly dying would leave me too weak to fight back. She'd counted on my gratitude for surviving overwhelming any anger about what happened while I was vulnerable. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning, I called every law firm in Portland until I found one willing to take a consultation about estate fraud. Marcus Rodriguez's office was located in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, and when I explained my situation, his interest was immediate and intense. "Bring me every document you have," he said. "If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just a family dispute. This is criminal fraud, and we're going to make sure your sister understands the difference." I left his office with a legal pad full of notes and a timeline for building my case. 6 weeks until Chloe's wedding. 6 weeks to gather evidence, document the fraud, and prepare for the confrontation that would change everything. She'd stolen from me while I was fighting for my life. Now I was going to show her exactly what I'd learned about fighting. The investigation began immediately. Marcus connected me with a forensic accountant who specialized in estate fraud, and together we started tracing every financial transaction related to Grandma Rose's property sale. What we discovered was even worse than I'd initially realized. Chloe hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She'd been planning it for months, possibly since Grandma Rose first became ill. Bank records showed she'd opened a secondary account just weeks after Grandma's diagnosis, and email records we subpoenaed revealed communications with estate attorneys dating back to before Grandma had even passed away. But the most damaging evidence came from Chloe's own digital trail. Text messages between her and Marcus discussing timing the legal modifications with Zoe's medical situation. Calendar entries in her phone marking my surgery date with the notation paperwork day. Even social media posts that painted her as the devoted sister caring for family responsibilities while I was unable to handle complex decisions. Every piece of evidence painted the same picture. Chloe had viewed my heart attack not as a family crisis, but as a business opportunity. 3 weeks before her wedding, we had enough evidence to file both civil and criminal charges. But Marcus suggested a different approach. "Your sister is getting married to an attorney," he pointed out. "A wedding with 200 guests, probably costing more of your money than she should be spending. What if we gave her a chance to make this right before we destroy her publicly?" I understood what he was suggesting, but I also understood something he didn't. Chloe had never made anything right in her life when she could avoid consequences instead. She'd taken my inheritance because she believed I was too weak to stop her. No, I said firmly. She made her choice when she brought those papers to my hospital bed. Now she gets to live with the consequences. But I didn't tell Marcus about the plan that was already forming in my mind. A plan that would require one very specific qualification I was about to spend the next 3 weeks obtaining. Oregon has a provision that allows qualified individuals to serve as temporary judicial officers for civil proceedings, particularly in cases involving family financial disputes. It requires passing a competency exam, completing a brief training program, and demonstrating knowledge of relevant legal procedures. I threw myself into the studying with the same intensity I'd applied to cardiac rehabilitation. Property law, estate procedures, civil fraud statutes. I memorized case precedents and filing requirements, learning the legal system from the inside out. The examination was scheduled for the Friday before Chloe's Saturday wedding. When I walked out of the courthouse with my temporary judicial certification, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with reclaiming power that had been stolen from me. Chloe had spent months planning the perfect wedding: elegant venue, designer dress, 200 carefully selected guests. She'd spared no expense, literally, since much of it was my expense. But she'd made one crucial oversight in her planning. She'd forgotten to consider what would happen if the sister she'd stolen from decided to crash the party, not as a guest seeking reconciliation, as a judge seeking justice. The morning after receiving my judicial certification, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt since before my heart attack. My apartment filled with golden Portland sunlight streaming through the large windows, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim recovering from trauma. I felt like someone preparing for war. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister who had always been the family truth-teller. Heard through the grapevine that tomorrow's wedding might have some surprises. Coffee? We met at a small cafe in the Hawthorne district, away from the places where Chloe might appear with her pre-wedding errands. Patricia looked exactly like she always had. Silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing clothes that prioritized comfort over fashion, carrying a worn leather purse that had seen decades of use. "You look better," she said, studying my face across the small table. Stronger, different. "I found out what Chloe did," I said without preamble. "The inheritance money. She stole it while I was in the hospital." Patricia's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. She set it down carefully, her expression shifting from concern to something that looked almost like relief. "I wondered when you'd figure it out." The admission hit me like a physical blow. "You knew?" I suspected. Patricia's voice carried the weight of family secrets kept too long. "Chloe came to me about 3 weeks after your surgery, asking questions about estate law and medical power of attorney. Said she was worried about protecting family assets while you were mentally compromised by your medications." My hands clenched around my own coffee cup. "And you didn't warn me?" "I tried calling the hospital twice. They said you weren't taking calls except from immediate family." Patricia's eyes filled with regret. "By the time I could reach you directly, you were already home, and Chloe was telling everyone the estate had been simplified to reduce your stress during recovery." The familiar pattern of my family's dysfunction crystallized in that moment. Everyone knew something was wrong, but nobody wanted to be the one to cause conflict by speaking up. They'd all chosen comfortable silence over protecting me. "There's more?" Patricia continued, lowering her voice. "The wedding expenses. Chloe's been spending money like she won the lottery. $50,000 venue, designer dress that cost more than some people's cars, catering for 200 guests. Your mother mentioned that Chloe suddenly had access to funds from Grandma Rose's estate." "My funds," I corrected. "Your funds," she agreed. "Zoe, I've been watching this family enable Chloe's behavior for 30 years. She's always been the golden child who could do no wrong. and everyone else has always been expected to adjust their expectations to accommodate her wants. I thought about every family gathering where Chloe had been the center of attention, every holiday where her achievements were celebrated while mine were footnoted, every crisis where the family's energy went toward protecting her reputation instead of addressing the actual problem. "Not this time," I said. Patricia leaned forward. "What are you planning?" I told her about the evidence Marcus and I had gathered, about the judicial certification, about my intention to serve Chloe, with legal papers at her own wedding. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing more approving with each detail. "Good," she said when I finished. "It's about time someone in this family faced real consequences for their actions." That afternoon, I drove to the address Marcus had given me for the final evidence review. His office was buzzing with activity: paralegals, organizing documents, investigators downloading phone records, accountants preparing financial summaries. The case against Chloe had grown into something that looked like preparation for a major corporate lawsuit. "We have enough evidence to file criminal charges," Marcus reported, spreading the documentation across his conference table. Forged signatures, fraudulent transfers, identity theft, elder abuse related to the original estate manipulation. The prosecutor's office is very interested. I studied the timeline we'd constructed. Chloe's planning had begun even before Grandma Rose died, with preliminary legal consultations about estate modifications. She'd researched medical power of attorney laws specifically related to cardiac patients. She'd even taken out additional insurance policies on herself, as if anticipating a windfall. She didn't just take advantage of an opportunity, I realized. She created a comprehensive plan to steal from me. "And she documented almost all of it digitally," Marcus added. "Text messages, emails, calendar entries, financial transactions. It's like she never considered the possibility that anyone would investigate." The arrogance was typical Chloe. She'd spent her entire life getting away with selfish behavior because family members preferred avoiding conflict to holding her accountable. She'd naturally assumed this would be the same. "What's our strongest evidence?" I asked. Marcus pulled out a folder marked with red tabs. "The hospital paperwork she brought you to sign. We had a handwriting expert analyze your signature on those documents compared to your actual signature from medical records. It's not even close. She either forged your signature or coerced you to sign while you were medically compromised." "She coerced me," I said, remembering the fog of medication and exhaustion, the way she'd rushed me through the signing process. "That's actually worse legally," Marcus explained. "Taking advantage of someone's medical vulnerability is considered elder abuse under Oregon law, even when the victim isn't elderly. The penalties are severe." The weight of what we were about to do settled over me. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money anymore. Chloe was facing potential criminal charges that could result in prison time. "Are you sure you want to proceed?" Marcus asked gently. "Once we file these charges, there's no going back. Your sister's life is going to change permanently." I thought about the version of myself who had signed those papers in the hospital bed. Trusting, vulnerable, grateful just to be alive. I thought about Chloe calculating the perfect moment to strike, bringing fraudulent documents to someone recovering from a near-death experience. "She made her choice," I said. "Now she gets to live with it." The next morning was Chloe's wedding day. I woke before dawn and spent an hour in meditation, a practice I'd developed during cardiac rehabilitation to manage anxiety. Today would require every ounce of emotional control I could muster. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected authority without being flashy. The judicial robes I would wear later were hanging in my closet like a costume for the most important performance of my life. My hair was styled in a professional updo, and I wore minimal makeup that made me look serious and competent. The wedding was scheduled for 4 o'clock at Riverfront Gardens Estate, an elegant venue overlooking the Columbia River. I'd been there once before for a charity fundraiser and remembered the layout. Main reception hall with floor-to-ceiling windows, smaller ceremony space with garden views, multiple exits that would be important for my planned entrance and exit. I arrived at Marcus's office at noon for our final preparation. The legal documents were organized in a leather portfolio, each page flagged and indexed. We'd prepared 3 sets, one for Chloe, one for the court filing, and one for the prosecutor's office. "Remember," Marcus coached me, "you're there in an official capacity. Keep your emotions in check, stick to the legal facts, and don't let anyone goad you into a personal argument." At 2:30, I changed into my judicial robes in Marcus's office bathroom. The black fabric felt like armor, transforming me from Chloe's vulnerable little sister into an officer of the court with the authority to compel legal proceedings. Marcus drove me to the venue in his car, both of us silent during the 20-minute trip. Portland's late afternoon traffic was light, and we arrived with perfect timing, just as the wedding ceremony was concluding, and guests were moving toward the reception hall. I could see Chloe through the large windows, radiant in a designer gown that probably cost $15,000 of my money. She was laughing with her new husband, accepting congratulations from guests, posing for photos that would commemorate what she thought was the happiest day of her life. She had no idea it was about to become the day her entire world collapsed. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked. I checked my watch. 4:45. The reception would be in full swing, with all the guests present and the formal toasts about to begin. Perfect timing for maximum impact. "Let's go," I said. We walked through the main entrance of Riverfront Gardens estate like we belonged there. The staff assumed we were late-arriving guests, and none of the family members noticed our entrance, because they were all focused on the bride and groom's grand entrance into the reception hall. The room was exactly as elegant as I'd expected. Round tables with white linens and elaborate centerpieces, a dance floor polished to mirror brightness, a head table where Chloe and her new husband sat like royalty holding court. The guest list included everyone who mattered in our family's social circle: business associates, college friends, distant relatives who'd traveled from other states. All of them were about to witness something they'd never forget. I positioned myself near the head table while Marcus took a spot by the main entrance. Chloe was mid-laugh at something her maid of honor had whispered when she finally noticed me standing 3 feet away from her chair. Her smile froze. Her eyes traveled from my face to the judicial robes to the leather portfolio in my hands. The color drained from her cheeks so quickly I thought she might faint. "Zoe?" she said, her voice barely audible over the reception. Chatter. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here in my official capacity as a temporary judicial officer for the state of Oregon," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quieting room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as guests turned to stare at the unexpected drama unfolding at the head table. Chloe's new husband leaned forward, his attorney instincts immediately alert. "What's this about?" I opened the portfolio and removed the first set of documents. "Zoe Harper, you are hereby served with a civil complaint for fraudulent transfer of assets, forgery, and theft by deception in the amount of $580,000. The silence in the room was absolute. 200 guests watched as I placed the legal papers in front of the bride, who was now shaking visibly. "You're also being served with a criminal complaint for elder abuse, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud," I continued, placing the second set of documents beside the first. "These charges have been filed with the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office and carry potential penalties of up to 10 years in prison." Chloe's bouquet slipped from her hands and scattered white roses across the pristine tablecloth. "Zoe, please, can't we discuss this privately?" "The time for private discussion was when you brought fraudulent documents to my hospital bed while I was recovering from a heart attack," I replied. "You chose to handle this publicly by stealing from me. Now you get to face the consequences publicly." Her new husband grabbed the papers, his face growing pale as he scanned the legal language. As an attorney himself, he understood immediately how serious the charges were. "This is insane," Chloe said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "I'm your sister. I would never steal from you." I pulled out the final piece of evidence, a printed copy of the text message thread between Chloe and her husband, discussing timing the legal modifications with Zoe's medical situation. "Your own messages say otherwise," I said, placing the printout where the entire head table could see it. "You planned this theft for months, waiting for the perfect moment when I would be too sick to protect myself." The room erupted. Guests were pulling out phones to record the confrontation. Family members were shouting questions and denials, and Chloe was sobbing into her hands while her wedding dress spread around her like spilled milk. My parents appeared at my side, both talking at once. "Zoe, this is inappropriate. How could you ruin her wedding day? Can't family problems be handled privately?" "I didn't ruin her wedding day," I said calmly. "She ruined it the moment she decided to fund it with money stolen from her hospitalized sister." Marcus appeared beside me, his presence adding official weight to the proceedings. "Mrs. Harper," he addressed Chloe formally, "you have 30 days to respond to the civil complaint and 60 days to arrange legal representation for the criminal charges. Failure to respond will result in default judgment and immediate asset seizure." Chloe looked up from her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Zoe, please. I can explain everything. I was trying to protect the money while you were sick. I was going to give it back." "When?" I asked. "Before or after you spent it on your $50,000 wedding?" She had no answer because there was no answer. The evidence spoke for itself. Months of planning, systematic theft, and elaborate lies to cover her tracks. I looked around, the room at the faces of family and friends who had watched this drama unfold. Some looked shocked, others seemed to be putting pieces together that they'd suspected but never voiced. A few were already quietly gathering their belongings, clearly uncomfortable with being witnesses to such a public family destruction. "The money you stole was meant to cover my medical expenses and provide security, while I recovered from nearly dying," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Instead, you used it to throw yourself a party while I struggled to pay hospital bills." I closed the portfolio and stepped back from the head table. My job here was finished. The legal system would handle the rest. "Enjoy your reception," I said to Chloe. "It's the last party you'll be able to afford for a very long time." As Marcus and I walked toward the exit, the room behind us exploded into chaos. Voices rose in argument, chairs scraped against the floor, and I could hear Chloe's sobs echoing off the high ceilings, but I didn't look back. I'd spent too many years of my life looking backward, trying to understand why my family treated me like an afterthought, wondering what I could do differently to earn their love and respect. Now I was looking forward, toward a future where I would never again allow anyone to take advantage of my trust or vulnerability. The cardiac rehabilitation program had taught me that recovery isn't just about healing damaged tissue. It's about building strength in places that were previously weak, developing new patterns that protect against future injury. Chloe had assumed that nearly dying would leave me permanently weakened, grateful just to be included on the margins of family events. She'd calculated that I would be too emotionally fragile to fight back against her theft. She'd never considered that surviving something that should have killed me might actually make me stronger than I'd ever been before. That facing my own mortality might clarify exactly what mattered and what didn't. As Marcus and I drove away from Riverfront Gardens estate, I could see the venue's elegant windows glowing in the evening light. Inside, 200 guests were witnessing the consequences of choices Chloe had made months ago, when she decided that my vulnerability was her opportunity. She'd thrown herself a beautiful wedding with my stolen money. Now she would spend the next several years dealing with the legal consequences in courtrooms that weren't nearly as elegant as her reception hall. The irony wasn't lost on me. Chloe had always been the family member who got everything she wanted without facing consequences. Today, for the first time in her life, the bill had finally come due. And unlike my medical expenses, this was one debt she wouldn't be able to steal her way out of paying. The week following Chloe's wedding disaster passed in a blur of phone calls, legal meetings, and media attention I hadn't anticipated. Apparently, serving legal papers at a wedding reception was newsworthy enough to attract local reporters, and the story of the hospitalized sister who became a judge to confront her thieving sibling resonated with people across the country. My phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, talk show producers, and people sharing their own stories of family betrayal. I ignored most of them, focusing instead on building the strongest possible case with Marcus and our growing team of legal specialists. The forensic accountant had uncovered even more damaging evidence during her deep dive into Chloe's financial records. Not only had she stolen my inheritance, but she'd also been systematically draining other family accounts that she had access to through her position as mom and dad's financial power of attorney. "Look at this," Dr. Amanda Foster said, spreading bank statements across Marcus's conference table. She'd become our lead investigator after discovering her talent for unraveling complex financial schemes. "Your sister has been moving money from your parents' retirement accounts into her personal investments for the past 18 months. The numbers were staggering. Beyond my $580,000, Chloe had diverted nearly $200,000 from various family accounts, always in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but large enough to fund her increasingly expensive lifestyle. She's been running a long-term embezzlement operation," Marcus observed, reviewing the transaction patterns. "This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was a calculated financial crime spree." I studied the evidence with a mixture of disgust and admiration for Chloe's thoroughness. She'd researched banking regulations, studied financial privacy laws, and carefully structured her thefts to minimize detection. If I hadn't been motivated by my own stolen inheritance to investigate, she might have continued indefinitely. "What's our timeline for prosecution?" I asked. "The district attorney wants to move quickly," Marcus replied. "Public interest is high, the evidence is overwhelming, and they want to send a message about financial elder abuse. We're looking at arraignment within 2 weeks." That same afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Jessica Kim, the wedding planner who had coordinated Chloe's reception. Her voice was professionally polite, but strained with obvious discomfort. "Miss Harper, I'm calling about the outstanding balance on your sister's wedding account," she said. "Given the circumstances that occurred at the reception, we're concerned about payment for our services." "What outstanding balance?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. $15,000 for additional services and upgrades that were added in the final weeks before the wedding. Your sister assured us that payment would be processed immediately following the ceremony. Of course, Chloe had run up additional charges right until the end, confident that she'd gotten away with her theft and could afford whatever she wanted. I wondered how many other vendors were discovering that their payments were tied to stolen money. "I'm not responsible for my sister's debts," I told the wedding planner, "but I'd be happy to provide you with her attorney's contact information for payment discussions." After hanging up, I realized that Chloe's financial house of cards was collapsing faster than even I had anticipated. The criminal charges were only the beginning of her problems. She'd built an entire lifestyle on stolen money, and every aspect of that lifestyle was about to become legally complicated. My parents finally called me directly 3 days after the wedding. Mom's voice was tight with the kind of controlled anger she reserved for situations that threatened the family's public image. "Zoe, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "This vendetta against your sister has gone too far." "Vendetta?" I repeated. "She stole nearly $600,000 from me while I was in the hospital recovering from a heart attack." "Family financial arrangements are complicated," Dad's voice joined the call. "Chloe was trying to protect assets during a medical crisis. Her intentions were good." The familiar pattern of my family's dysfunction was reasserting itself even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Chloe could commit crimes, cause public humiliation, and destroy family relationships. But somehow it would still be my fault for not quietly accepting whatever she chose to do. Her intentions were to steal my inheritance and use it to fund her wedding, I said. We have text messages where she discusses timing the theft to coincide with my medical vulnerability. Those messages could be interpreted many ways, Mom replied, but publicly humiliating her at her wedding was cruel and unnecessary. I felt the old familiar anger rising, the frustration of trying to explain obvious truths to people who were determined not to see them. But this time, instead of getting drawn into an emotional argument, I felt something else. Pity. My parents had spent decades enabling Chloe's selfish behavior, always finding ways to excuse or minimize her actions. They'd trained themselves to ignore evidence and reshape reality to maintain their preferred narrative. Now, faced with criminal charges and public scrutiny, they were still trying to make me the problem instead of holding Chloe accountable. I'm not interested in having this conversation, I told them. If you want to discuss Chloe's legal situation, you can contact Marcus Rodriguez. If you want to rebuild a relationship with me, you can start by acknowledging what actually happened, instead of pretending I'm the villain in this story. I hung up before they could respond, and immediately blocked their numbers. I'd spent too many years accepting their version of family dynamics where I was always expected to accommodate Chloe's wants and needs while my own were considered secondary. That era of my life was permanently over. The arraignment hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the Multnomah County Courthouse. I arrived early and found the courtroom already packed with spectators, reporters, and what appeared to be several of Chloe's former friends who had come to witness her public downfall. Chloe entered with her attorney, an expensive-looking criminal, defense lawyer who had probably cost her the last of whatever legitimate money she had access to. She was wearing a conservative black suit that was clearly chosen to make her appear contrite and responsible, but her eyes were darting around the courtroom with the panicked energy of someone who was finally understanding the gravity of her situation. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Williams, was a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for taking financial crimes seriously. She reviewed the charges with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had seen every variation of greed and betrayal that humans could devise. Miss Harper, she addressed Chloe, you are charged with theft in the first degree, identity theft, fraudulent use of a credit card, and elder abuse. How do you plead? Chloe's attorney whispered urgently in her ear before she responded in a barely audible voice. Not guilty, Your Honor. The plea was expected, but hearing it still sent a surge of anger through me. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple witnesses, Chloe was refusing to take responsibility for her actions. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Robert Chen, stood to address the court. Your Honor, the state requests that bail be set at $500,000. The defendant has shown a pattern of sophisticated financial crimes, has access to substantial assets of questionable origin, and represents a flight risk given the severity of the charges. Chloe's attorney immediately objected. Your Honor, my client has deep community ties, no prior criminal record, and fully intends to contest these charges through the proper legal channels. We request release on her own recognizance. Judge Williams considered both arguments before ruling. Given the substantial amount of money involved and the sophisticated nature of the alleged crimes, bail is set at $250,000. The defendant will surrender her passport and submit to weekly check-ins with a probation officer. I watched Chloe's face crumble as the reality of her situation became clear. She didn't have $250,000 in legitimate assets to post bail. Most of her recent wealth had come from stolen money, and those assets were now frozen pending the outcome of the criminal case. Her new husband would have to choose between bankrupting himself to bail her out or letting her sit in jail while awaiting trial. Either way, their marriage was starting under circumstances that would have destroyed most relationships. After the hearing, Marcus and I met with Prosecutor Chen to discuss the case timeline and strategy. He was a sharp, methodical attorney who had built his career on complex financial crime cases. "We're looking at a trial date in approximately 6 months," he explained. "Your sister's attorney will likely try to negotiate a plea deal, especially once they realize how strong our evidence is." "What kind of plea deal?" I asked. "Probably guilty to theft charges in exchange for dropping the elder abuse and identity theft counts. She'd be looking at 3 to 5 years in prison instead of the potential 10 to 15 she's facing if convicted on all charges." The idea of Chloe serving even 3 years in prison was both satisfying and strange. I'd grown up with this person, shared holidays and family vacations. And despite everything, some part of me still remembered the sister who had occasionally been kind when we were children. But that nostalgia was overwhelmed by the memory of signing those papers in my hospital bed, trusting her when I was at my most vulnerable, and discovering months later that she'd used my near-death experience as an opportunity to steal from me. "I want her to face the full consequences of what she did," I told the prosecutor. "No plea deals that minimize the seriousness of her crimes." Over the following weeks, the case continued to generate media attention and public interest. I received hundreds of emails from people sharing their own stories of family financial abuse, many of them describing similar situations where medical crises had been exploited by relatives seeking quick access to money or property. One email particularly stood out, from a woman named Linda whose brother had stolen her inheritance while she was undergoing cancer treatment. "Reading your story gave me the courage to finally file charges against him," she wrote. "I thought I was the only person who had experienced something like this." The response made me realize that Chloe's crime wasn't as unusual as I'd initially thought. There was apparently an entire category of financial predators who specifically targeted family members during medical crises, counting on the victim's gratitude for survival to override their anger about the theft. I started researching the phenomenon and discovered that financial abuse of medically vulnerable family members was severely underreported, partly because victims were often too emotionally drained to pursue legal action, and partly because family members pressured them to handle such matters privately. The research sparked an idea that would eventually reshape my entire approach to the case and its aftermath. But first, I had to get through the trial and whatever consequences Chloe would finally face. 3 weeks after the arraignment, I received a call from Marcus with unexpected news. "Chloe's attorney wants to schedule a settlement conference," he said. "They're realizing that taking this case to trial would be catastrophic for her." "What kind of settlement are they proposing?" "Full restitution of the stolen money plus damages, a public apology, and a guilty plea to reduced charges that would result in probation instead of prison time." I considered the offer carefully. Getting my money back was important, but it wasn't the only thing I wanted from this process. Chloe had committed crimes that went far beyond stealing from me, and other victims deserved to see justice served. "What about the money she stole from our parents and other family members?" "That would be part of the full restitution," Marcus explained. "She'd have to account for all the stolen funds and pay everything back with interest." The financial restitution was appealing, but the idea of Chloe avoiding prison time bothered me. She'd planned and executed sophisticated crimes over a period of months, specifically targeting people who were vulnerable due to medical conditions or advanced age. That kind of predatory behavior deserved serious consequences. "I need to think about it," I told Marcus. That night, I sat in my apartment reviewing all the evidence we'd gathered, thinking about the impact of Chloe's crimes on everyone involved. My parents had lost their retirement security. I'd nearly been bankrupted by medical bills I couldn't pay. Other family members had discovered that money they'd trusted Chloe to manage had been diverted for her personal use. But beyond the financial damage, there was the deeper betrayal of trust, the violation of family bonds, and the exploitation of people during their most vulnerable moments. Those harms couldn't be repaired with a simple payment plan and an apology. I called Marcus back. the next morning with my decision. No settlement, we're going to trial. The choice would prove to be more complicated and emotionally challenging than I anticipated, but it was also the decision that would ultimately transform not just my own life, but the lives of countless other people who had suffered similar betrayals. Chloe had counted on my gratitude for surviving overwhelming my anger about her theft. She'd assumed that family loyalty would eventually overcome my desire for justice. She'd calculated that I would prefer private resolution to public accountability. She was wrong on every count. The near-death experience that she'd tried to exploit had actually clarified my priorities in ways she couldn't understand. I'd learned the difference between surviving and truly living, between accepting mistreatment and demanding respect, between maintaining toxic relationships and building healthy boundaries. The trial would test all those lessons, but I was ready for whatever came next. I'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to me. Everything else was just a matter of choosing how to move forward with the time I'd been given. And I was choosing to move forward in a way that would ensure Chloe never again had the opportunity to exploit anyone's vulnerability for her own gain. The courtroom would be the place where she finally learned that actions have consequences, even for people who had spent their entire lives avoiding them. Especially for people who had spent their entire lives avoiding them. The trial of Zoe Harper began on a cold Tuesday morning in February, with snow falling steadily outside the courthouse windows and media vans lining the street. I arrived 2 hours early, needing time to prepare mentally for what would likely be the most emotionally challenging week of my life. The courtroom was larger than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and high ceilings that made every sound echo. I took my seat in the gallery, watching as reporters filled the press section and curious onlookers claimed the remaining spots. The case had generated enough public interest that the court had to implement a lottery system for seating. Chloe entered through a side door, flanked by her defense attorney and a paralegal carrying multiple briefcases. She looked dramatically different from the radiant bride I'd confronted at her wedding 6 months ago. Her hair was pulled back severely. She wore a plain gray suit that looked like it came from a discount store, and her face had the gaunt, hollow appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. Her new husband was notably absent from the courtroom. According to the courthouse gossip I'd overheard, their marriage had ended in divorce papers filed just 3 weeks after the wedding. Once he'd fully understood the scope of her financial crimes and the likelihood of lengthy prison sentences. Judge Williams called the court to order and addressed the packed courtroom with a stern warning about proper decorum. "This is a court of law, not a theatrical performance," she announced. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed immediately." The jury selection process had taken nearly 2 weeks, as prospective jurors were questioned extensively about their views on family loyalty, financial responsibility, and medical vulnerability. The final panel consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 60s, representing a cross-section of backgrounds and experiences. Prosecutor Chen stood to deliver his opening statement, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about predatory behavior at its most despicable. The defendant, Zoe Harper, systematically planned and executed a series of financial crimes targeting her own family members during their most vulnerable moments." He outlined the prosecution's case methodically, describing how Chloe had researched medical power of attorney laws, consulted with estate attorneys, and carefully timed her thefts to coincide with family medical crises. The evidence would show a pattern of behavior spanning over 2 years, involving multiple victims and sophisticated methods of concealment. "The defendant didn't steal impulsively or desperately," Chen continued. "She stole strategically, targeting people she knew would be too sick, too grateful, or too trusting to fight back. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a calculated business plan." Chloe's defense attorney, a slick-looking man named Thomas Morrison who specialized in white-collar crime, took a completely different approach in his opening statement. He painted Chloe as a devoted daughter and sister who had made honest mistakes, while trying to help family members manage complex financial situations during medical emergencies. My client is not the criminal mastermind the prosecution would have you believe, Morrison argued. She's a young woman who found herself overwhelmed by family responsibilities and made poor decisions under tremendous pressure. The evidence will show that she always intended to return any money she temporarily managed on behalf of her family members. The contrast between the two narratives was stark, and I could see several jurors taking notes as they tried to reconcile these opposing versions of Chloe's character and motivations. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Sarah Kim, the cardiac surgeon who had performed my emergency surgery. She testified about the severity of my condition and the extended recovery period required after such a major cardiac event. Patients recovering from massive heart attacks often experience cognitive impairment for weeks or months afterward, Dr. Kim explained. The combination of trauma, medication, and extended hospitalization can significantly impact decision-making capacity and vulnerability to manipulation. Under cross-examination, Morrison tried to suggest that my mental capacity had been fully restored by the time I signed the estate documents, but Dr. Kim firmly disagreed. Miss Harper was discharged from the hospital in a fragile state. She testified. Her medications alone would have impaired her judgment, and the psychological impact of nearly dying would have made her particularly susceptible to pressure from trusted family members. The next witness was Dr. Amanda Foster, our forensic accountant, who presented the financial evidence with devastating clarity. Using charts and graphs projected on large screens, she walked the jury through every transaction, every forged signature, and every carefully concealed transfer of funds. The defendant's financial activity shows clear premeditation, Dr. Foster testified. She opened specific accounts weeks before key family medical events, researched banking regulations to avoid detection, and structured transactions to fall just below reporting thresholds. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, email communications, text messages, and calendar entries all painted the same picture of systematic financial predation. Chloe had documented her own crimes so thoroughly that the prosecution barely needed to present additional evidence. Morrison's cross-examination of Dr. Foster focused on the complexity of estate management and the possibility of innocent mistakes, but the accountant's responses were unshakable. "These weren't mistakes," Dr. Foster replied firmly. "Mistakes don't involve forged signatures, false notarizations, and elaborate schemes to conceal transaction histories. These were deliberate criminal acts." The prosecution's third day focused on testimony from other family members who had been victims of Chloe's theft. Aunt Patricia took the stand wearing her best dress and speaking with quiet dignity about discovering that money she'd trusted Chloe to invest had been diverted to personal accounts. "I gave Chloe $25,000 to invest in a retirement fund," Patricia testified. "She provided me with fake statements showing the account growing, while actually spending the money on personal expenses. When I needed to withdraw funds for medical bills, she told me the market had crashed and the money was gone." The testimony continued with similar stories from other relatives, each describing how Chloe had exploited their trust and vulnerability. By the end of the third day, the prosecution had established a clear pattern of predatory behavior that went far beyond stealing from me during my hospitalization. My own testimony was scheduled for the fourth day of the trial. I'd spent weeks preparing with Chen and Marcus, reviewing every detail of my hospital stay and the circumstances surrounding the fraudulent documents Chloe had brought me to sign. Walking to the witness stand felt like moving through water, every step requiring conscious effort. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of my heels clicking against the polished floor. I could feel Chloe watching me, but I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. After being sworn in, Chen began his questioning gently, asking me to describe my medical condition and the events leading up to my hospitalization. I explained about the genetic heart defect that had caused my massive cardiac event at such a young age and the extended recovery period that followed. "Can you describe your mental and physical state when your sister visited you in the hospital?" Chen asked. I took a deep breath, remembering those hazy days when simply staying conscious required tremendous effort. I was heavily medicated, exhausted, and grateful to be alive. My cognitive abilities were significantly impaired, and I was dependent on family members for basic information about what was happening outside the hospital. "What did the defendant tell you about the documents she brought for you to sign?" "She said they were routine legal updates to modernize my grandmother's estate language for tax purposes," I replied. "She assured me that the changes were recommended by attorneys and would actually protect my interests during my recovery." Chen had me walk through each document I'd signed, explaining how Chloe had rushed me through the process and discouraged me from reading the fine print. The jury listened intently as I described my confusion and the way Chloe had dismissed my questions as unnecessary complications. "Did you understand that you were signing away your inheritance rights?" Chen asked. "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "If I had understood what those documents actually did, I never would have signed them. Chloe deliberately misrepresented their purpose because she knew I would refuse if I understood the truth." Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive and personal, clearly designed to make me appear vindictive and unreasonable. He questioned my memory of events, suggested that I had been mentally competent enough to understand what I was signing, and implied that my decision to confront Chloe at her wedding was evidence of a malicious personality. "Isn't it true that you've always been jealous of your sister's success?" Morrison asked. "No," I replied calmly. "I've always been proud of Chloe's achievements. What I object to is her decision to steal from me while I was hospitalized and unable to protect myself." "But you chose to ruin her wedding day instead of handling this matter privately, didn't you?" I felt a flash of anger but kept my voice steady. "Chloe chose to steal from her hospitalized sister instead of earning money honestly. The public nature of her crimes made private resolution impossible." Morrison continued pressing me about my motivations and emotions, but I'd prepared for this line of questioning. Every answer reinforced the central fact that Chloe had committed calculated crimes against vulnerable family members, regardless of my personal feelings about her actions. The defense case began on the 5th day, with Morrison calling character witnesses who testified about Chloe's previous generosity and community involvement. Former colleagues described her as helpful and trustworthy, while friends talked about her charitable work and family devotion. But the character testimony felt hollow against the mountain of evidence documenting her financial crimes. Good people don't systematically steal from hospitalized family members, regardless of their previous charitable activities. Chloe herself took the stand on the 6th day, against the advice of most legal experts who had been commenting on the case. Morrison had apparently decided that her only chance of avoiding conviction was to present her as a sympathetic figure who had made honest mistakes under pressure. Her testimony was emotional and carefully crafted, describing the stress of managing family finances during medical crises and the confusion that had led to accounting errors and miscommunications about estate management. "I never intended to steal from anyone," Chloe said, tears streaming down her face. "I was trying to help my family during difficult times, and I made mistakes in how I handled the financial arrangements." But Chen's cross-examination dismantled her testimony piece by piece, forcing her to confront the specific evidence of premeditation and deception. Email records showed her researching inheritance laws months before my heart attack. Text messages revealed her discussing opportunities created by family medical situations. Calendar entries documented her planning timeline for various financial manipulations. "If you were trying to help your family, why did you forge your sister's signature on multiple documents?" Chen asked. "I thought I was acting in her best interests," Chloe replied weakly. "Whose best interest were you serving when you spent her inheritance money on your wedding?" Chloe had no credible answer to that question or to the dozens of other inquiries that exposed the calculated nature of her crimes. By the time Chen finished his cross-examination, her entire defense had collapsed. Morrison's closing argument was a desperate attempt to portray Chloe as a well-meaning person who had made errors in judgment rather than a calculating criminal. He asked the jury to consider her lack of prior criminal history and her apparent remorse for the harm she had caused. But Chen's closing was devastating in its clarity and precision. He walked the jury through the evidence one final time, emphasizing the premeditation, the vulnerability of the victims, and the sophisticated methods used to conceal the crimes. The defendant asks for mercy based on her good intentions, Chen concluded. But good intentions don't involve forged signatures, falsified documents, and elaborate schemes to steal from hospitalized family members. The defendant's actions were calculated, predatory, and deserving of serious consequences. The jury deliberated for just over 4 hours before returning with their verdict. I sat in the courtroom holding my breath as the forepersons stood to announce their decision. On the charge of theft in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of identity theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraudulent use of a credit card, we find the defendant guilty. Each guilty verdict hit like a physical blow. Chloe collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, while her attorney stared at the table in defeat. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations as spectators processed the comprehensive nature of the convictions. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. As the courtroom cleared, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. The legal process had vindicated everything I'd claimed about Chloe's crimes, but the victory felt hollow against the backdrop of destroyed family relationships and years of upcoming legal consequences. Marcus found me in the hallway outside the courtroom, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal concern. "How do you feel?" I considered the question carefully. "Exhausted," I finally answered, "but also hopeful. For the first time in months, I feel like justice is actually possible." The sentencing hearing would be the final chapter of this legal saga, but I was already thinking beyond the courtroom toward the future I wanted to build with the hard-won knowledge that holding people accountable for their actions was both possible and necessary. Chloe had spent her entire life avoiding consequences for selfish behavior. In 3 weeks, she would finally learn what accountability actually meant, and I would finally be free to move forward without the weight of unresolved injustice dragging me down. The snow had stopped falling by the time I left the courthouse, and the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in sharp, clear light. It felt like an appropriate metaphor for the clarity that had emerged from months of legal proceedings. Some truths were painful but necessary. Some relationships were toxic but persistent. Some consequences were delayed but inevitable. All of those lessons would serve me well in the final phase of this journey, when the legal system would determine exactly what price Chloe would pay for her crimes against the people who had trusted her most. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later in the same courtroom where Chloe had been convicted. The atmosphere felt different this time, heavier with finality and the weight of impending consequences. I arrived early again, needing time to prepare for what would likely be my last opportunity to address Chloe directly about the impact of her crimes. The courtroom was less crowded than during the trial, with mostly family members, reporters, and legal professionals present. Chloe sat at the defendant's table wearing the same gray suit, but she looked even thinner and more defeated than she had during the verdict. Her attorney, Morrison, had clearly warned her about the severity of the potential sentences she was facing. Judge Williams entered promptly at 9 o'clock, and the formal proceedings began immediately. The probation officer presented a detailed pre-sentence report that outlined Chloe's background, the scope of her crimes, and recommendations for punishment. The report was damning in its assessment of her character and the calculated nature of her criminal behavior. The defendant shows limited genuine remorse for her actions, the probation officer stated. Her crimes were sophisticated, targeted, vulnerable victims, and caused substantial financial and emotional harm to multiple family members. The recommended sentence is 8 to 12 years in state prison. Morrison stood to present mitigation arguments, emphasizing Chloe's lack of prior criminal history, her education and professional background, and what he characterized as her genuine desire to make amends for her mistakes. But his arguments felt weak against the overwhelming evidence of premeditated financial predation. Prosecutor Chen then presented the state's sentencing recommendation, asking for the maximum penalty allowed under Oregon law. He emphasized the sophisticated nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the need to send a clear message that financial abuse of medically compromised family members would be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible. The defendant's crimes represent a particularly despicable form of betrayal, Chen argued. She didn't steal from strangers or even acquaintances. She systematically targeted her own family members during their most vulnerable moments, exploiting medical crises for personal financial gain. Then came the victim impact statements. Aunt Patricia went first, speaking quietly but firmly about the financial devastation and broken trust that Chloe's crimes had caused. She described having to delay necessary medical treatments because the money she'd entrusted to Chloe for safekeeping had been stolen and spent on luxury items. My parents also spoke, though their statements were brief and carefully neutral. They acknowledged the harm caused by Chloe's actions while still trying to maintain some semblance of family unity. Their reluctance to fully condemn her behavior was typical of the enablement that had allowed Chloe's selfish patterns to persist for so many years. When my name was called, I walked to the podium with a written statement I'd crafted over many sleepless nights. The words needed to capture not just the financial harm Chloe had caused, but the deeper betrayal of trust and exploitation of vulnerability that made her crimes so particularly damaging. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. 6 months ago, I nearly died from a massive heart attack. During the weeks I spent fighting for my life in the hospital, I was completely dependent on my family for support, information, and basic care. That dependency made me vulnerable in ways I'd never experienced before. I paused, looking directly at Chloe for the first time since entering the courtroom. She was staring at the table, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. The defendant chose to exploit that vulnerability for personal financial gain. While I was unconscious, medicated, and grateful just to be alive, she was planning ways to steal my inheritance. She brought fraudulent documents to my hospital bed, knowing I was too sick to read them carefully or understand their true purpose. The courtroom was completely silent as I continued. But the financial theft, devastating as it was, wasn't the worst part of what she did to me. The worst part was the betrayal of trust at a moment when I needed family support most. She turned my near-death experience into her business opportunity. I described the months of struggling to pay medical bills while Chloe was spending my inheritance on her wedding, the discovery of the forged documents, and the realization that her theft had been planned and calculated rather than impulsive. The defendant asks for mercy based on family relationships and her lack of prior criminal history, I concluded. But family relationships are exactly what make her crimes so serious. She didn't steal from a stranger who might have other resources or support systems. She stole from her sister during a medical crisis, knowing I would be too vulnerable to protect myself. I returned to my seat feeling emotionally drained, but also relieved to have finally articulated the full scope of what Chloe had done to me and why it deserved serious consequences. Chloe was then given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing. She stood slowly, her hands shaking as she held a single sheet of paper covered with handwritten notes. Your Honor, I want to apologize to my sister, my family, and everyone I've hurt through my actions, she began, her voice barely audible. I never intended for things to go this far or cause this much damage. I was overwhelmed by family responsibilities and made terrible decisions that I deeply regret. Her apology continued for several minutes, acknowledging the harm she'd caused while still trying to frame her crimes as mistakes rather than calculated theft. She promised to make full financial restitution and to dedicate her life to making amends for her actions. But the apology felt hollow and self-serving, focused more on minimizing her culpability than taking genuine responsibility for the systematic nature of her crimes. She still couldn't acknowledge that she'd deliberately planned to exploit my medical vulnerability for financial gain. Judge Williams listened to all the statements before announcing her sentencing decision. She took several minutes to review her notes and consider the evidence before speaking. "Miss Harper, your crimes represent a particularly egregious form of betrayal," she began. "You systematically targeted vulnerable family members, exploited medical crises for personal gain, and showed sophisticated planning in concealing your criminal activities." The judge outlined the specific factors that made Chloe's crime so serious: the vulnerability of the victims, the breach of family trust, the sophisticated methods used, and the substantial financial and emotional harm caused. Taking into account all factors, including your lack of prior criminal history and your expressions of remorse, I sentence you to 10 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 7 years. You are also ordered to pay full restitution of $780,000 to your victims, plus interest and court costs. Chloe collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of a decade in prison settled over her. Morrison immediately began discussing appeal options, but the comprehensive nature of the evidence made successful appeals unlikely. As the courtroom cleared, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, and Chloe would face serious consequences for her crimes. But there was also sadness at the complete destruction of family relationships and the years of legal proceedings that had consumed so much time and energy. Marcus approached me in the hallway, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal concern. "How do you feel about the sentence?" I considered the question carefully. "It feels appropriate," I said finally. Chloe made calculated decisions to commit serious crimes against vulnerable family members. The sentence reflects the seriousness of what she did. Over the following months, as the appeals process played out and the media attention gradually faded, I began focusing on rebuilding my life and figuring out what lessons I wanted to take from this experience. The restitution payments would eventually restore my financial security, but the more important changes were personal and emotional. I'd learned that surviving a near-death experience wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about deciding what kind of life I wanted to live with the time I'd been given. The months of legal proceedings had taught me that demanding accountability wasn't vindictive or cruel. It was necessary for protecting both myself and other potential victims. I started volunteering with a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to elderly people and medical patients who had been financially exploited by family members. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding, helping other people navigate the same kind of betrayal and legal complexity I'd experienced. Through this work, I met dozens of people whose stories paralleled my own. Family members who had stolen from hospitalized relatives, children who had drained their elderly parents' accounts, and relatives who had forged signatures on estate documents. The patterns were depressingly consistent, but so was the possibility of justice when victims were willing to pursue legal remedies. My relationship with my parents remained strained, but gradually improved as they began to understand the full scope of what Chloe had done and why I'd felt compelled to pursue criminal charges. They never fully acknowledged their role in enabling her behavior, but they stopped trying to minimize her crimes or blame me for the consequences she faced. A year after Chloe's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison. The letter was several pages long, handwritten on institutional stationery, and filled with what appeared to be genuine remorse for her actions. She described the reality of prison life, her participation in financial responsibility programs, and her plans for making amends when she was eventually released. I read the letter twice before putting it away in a drawer. I wasn't ready to forgive Chloe or rebuild any kind of relationship with her, but I also wasn't consumed by anger about what she'd done. The legal process had provided the accountability I'd needed, and I was now focused on moving forward rather than looking backward. 2 years later, I was invited to speak at a medical conference about financial vulnerability during health crises. The presentation focused on protecting patients from exploitation and recognizing warning signs of financial abuse by family members. The audience of doctors, nurses, and social workers was deeply engaged, asking thoughtful questions about prevention strategies and legal resources. After the presentation, a young doctor approached me with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother went through something similar," she said. "We never pursued legal action because we thought it would be too divisive for the family. Your story makes me realize we made a mistake." Those conversations reminded me why I'd chosen to pursue justice rather than private resolution. Chloe's crimes weren't just personal matters that affected our family. They were part of a larger pattern of exploitation that harmed vulnerable people across the country. By holding her accountable publicly, I'd contributed to awareness and prevention efforts that might protect other potential victims. The cardiac rehabilitation program had taught me that recovery involves building strength in previously damaged areas. The legal process had taught me that justice involves holding people accountable for their actions, even when those people are family members you once loved and trusted. Both lessons had transformed me from someone who happened to bad things into someone who actively shaped the direction of her own life. I'd learned the difference between surviving and thriving, between accepting mistreatment and demanding respect, between maintaining toxic relationships and building healthy boundaries. Chloe had assumed that nearly dying would leave me permanently weakened and grateful. She'd calculated that family loyalty would override my desire for justice. She'd planned her crimes around my vulnerability, never considering that surviving something that should have killed me might actually make me stronger than I'd ever been before. She'd been wrong about everything. The experience that was supposed to destroy me had clarified my priorities and strengthened my resolve. The vulnerability she'd tried to exploit had become the foundation for helping other people in similar situations. 5 years after her sentencing, Chloe was still in prison, with 2 more years before she would be eligible for parole. I'd moved on with my life, built a career helping other exploitation victims, and developed relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Sometimes people asked if I regretted pursuing criminal charges against my sister instead of handling the matter privately. The answer was always the same. I regretted that Chloe had chosen to commit crimes against her hospitalized sister, but I never regretted holding her accountable for those choices. Some wounds don't heal with time and forgiveness. Some heal with justice and boundaries. Some relationships can't be repaired, only ended. Some family bonds are toxic rather than nurturing. All of those lessons had been painful, but necessary. They'd taught me that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about choosing to live in ways that honor your own worth and protect your future well-being. I'd survived a heart attack that should have killed me. I'd survived financial theft that should have bankrupted me. I'd survived family betrayal that should have broken me. Instead, I'd learned to thrive in ways I'd never imagined possible before nearly losing everything that mattered. The girl who'd trusted blindly had become a woman who demanded accountability. The victim who'd been exploited had become an advocate, who protected others. That transformation had been worth every difficult moment of the journey from that hospital bed to the courtroom where justice was finally served. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.